All right, so there's three main reasons that people struggle with drawing the figure or just drawing in general. But number one is they don't go simple enough. Number two, they usually advance too fast, and we'll get back to that as well. They never go back to basics, number three. And number four, they forget to play. Now, I've seen this throughout my career, both with professionals, aspiring professionals, and people that just want to get better as a hobby. And I've seen it repeated over and over and over. So I'll break it down so that you can better understand how to actually fix your figure drawing and just get better at it overall. So first and foremost is the main masses trick, all right? And this is basically going to simple enough. What that means is that you need to break down the figure into three simple masses. And those simple masses are essentially just boxes. We have a box for the head, we have a box for the rib cage, and we have a box for the pelvis. Right, so these are three masses and the proportions slightly differ. And with these three masses, we can form the rest of the body. That's how simple you go. That's it. That's all you need to do. And so understanding this is the first part. We need to go simple enough because based on your level of understanding, that's where you should draw form. I think a lot of the times people want to force themselves into understanding something they're not yet ready for. So I'm going to repeat that. People try to force themselves into understanding things they're not yet ready for. And this is similar to learning anything, is learning how to cook, learning how to do sports. It doesn't really matter what you do. It's the learning part, right? So the learning part, that's what you want to get to. In order to learn, you need to understand what you're learning. So you need to go simple enough. So that's like start to understand these three main masses of the body. Once you understand them, then you have to use these forms to start doing more complex things. And what I mean by that is that you don't start overcomplicating the forms. Especially for the figure, you actually start to apply figure stuff on top of it, meaning posing, dynamic posing, gesture, all of that. So what that would mean for, let's say, the three simple masses is that you first start to experiment with just the placement of these bodies, these main masses, compared to each other. And this is essentially sort of our observation technique at Artwod. Is can I look at something, can I observe something, and distill it into its simplest forms. So here we are essentially creating sort of a dynamic figure pose with simple boxes. For instance, also a body leaning forward like this. So we're stacking things in relation to each other using simple form. So we're learning more about bodies in general just by doing this, right? We do this from observation, we do this from imagination, just to ingrain all of that information. What we can then do, and this is the cool thing about it, we can start creating things like an advanced stick figure. So we can start adding things to this. So we can start adding just simple, like this is a stick figure mannequin that we teach at Artwod, which is basically using the three simple masses and then using gestural lines for the limbs, right? So you can be doing things like this. And so you can see that you can start to become very dynamic with these figures using fairly simple things, using fairly simple shapes. So this teaches you advanced techniques that you actually need to understand with in the most simplest way possible. So I cannot understate this. You learn very advanced things using the simplest ways or the simplest forms possible. And this is where a lot of you get it twisted up. You think you need to go from simple forms to more complex forms to even more complex anatomical forms, and then only start doing these advanced techniques. And it's actually the other way around. You should start to become very, very confident with this simplicity and then only apply complexity on top of it when you're ready for it. Because by doing this, you can not only draw more dynamic forms, you can also understand the figure better in general. Because in order to draw convincing figures, you also need to understand the balance of the figure, meaning that you need to understand where the weight of the figure is distributed. And if you're distracted by very complex anatomical forms, again, your figures will look wonky. This is what I see with beginners all of the time, is that their figures just look off balance. And that's a much bigger tell sign, or like a much bigger sign of incompetence than using very simple forms in the right way with correct proportion and correct balance. Those figures will look better than very anatomically accurate or close to accurate figures off balance. Then once we move into anatomy, so more complexity, again, what we're actually trying to do is trying to better understand the complexity. So again, we try to understand the simplest forms available to us and understandable to us, and see how that relates to anatomy. This is essentially our entire teaching strategy at Artwod. So that basically means is that we take that really simplified version of something like the torso, or the rib cage even, and then we see, okay, what does that look like in a more anatomical form? The first would just essentially be the X shape that better represents the rib cage, like that, with the neck on top. So when we understand that, then we can see, okay, how can we introduce more forms that will better represent the body overall? So we can start adding things like the cylinder on top, and a manipulated box for the pecs, and a manipulated cylinder for the traps. And then we can start to combine these forms. And then by combining these forms, we understand that this more closely represents an anatomical figure. We can do the same for the abdomen part. We can do the same for the legs. We can do the same for anything, essentially. And so that then becomes a more complex figure. But we break it down into these step-by-step things, and we pause at a certain level of understanding, and again apply the more human part of figure drawing. So that is, again, is gesture and balance, right, and acting. So again, when you do that, then you understand that figure at level 2 a lot better. And then you go to level 3 and add more complexity, and again make it more human-like. So you do this back and forth. This is what we call going back to basics all of the time. It's not about trying to start and draw a as complex as possible figure and then applying things like gesture and animation at the end, because you'll still be confused. The only thing you'll be good at is drawing a very static, somewhat anatomically accurate figure. But the goal is to draw characters. And here's a secret. You don't need that much anatomy knowledge to draw cool characters, right? So that's why I think it's so important to always go back to basics and understand basics. And then the last thing is what we like to call play, practice, play. And this essentially stems from being an artist. The kid inside of you always starts with play. You just start to draw. You doodle in class, you do whatever, right? That's the play part. Now you need to practice things, right? So what a lot of you do is you sort of come out of that play part and you go into practice and you stay in the practice zone. We call a lot of you the eternal students, right? So you're doing more figure studies, more anatomy studies, more in-depth, but you stop playing. And you need the 3 Ps. You need to practice, you need to play, you need practice, and then you need to get out of practice and play again. So that means that you need to take those things that you've learned and play with them again. Because, and this, I covered this in our figure road, in our beginner figure road, is that made me come up with a more advanced figure, which I like to call like the t-shirt pants figure, which is fantastic for learning how to draw figures. It essentially is drawing a box for the head, again, keeping it incredibly simple. And then attached to that, we don't draw anything with 3D form anymore. We just draw a t-shirt shape, which we all know how to draw. Everyone knows how to draw a t-shirt shape like this, and pants attached to it. And everyone knows how to draw pants, right? And then you can draw arms attached to that, doesn't really matter, or you can make it into a long sleeve t-shirt as well, like that. Now, this is very 2D, but this is the play aspect of it, because we can use this and draw this essentially, if our spatial understanding is good, we can draw this in any angle and we can play with the figure itself. So we can have a figure, right, that we're looking on top of like this, and we can have that figure even maybe sitting in a chair. So this with its arms, maybe backward, that, and then like that, right? So this is 2D. This is purely 2D. I'm not doing anything like great, right? It's not like this is a fantastic figure drawing, but it allows me to play with the figure. And I can make a cool figure as well. So I can even start with the t-shirt design, let's say, right? And we have like a figure standing in a very cool, more of like a hero pose like this, with its head looking like way up. And I can play with the proportions as well, like that, right? So this looks simple, but if you don't practice this, if you don't play with this, you essentially become a very rigid artist, and you're losing a lot of artistic and creative potential. And this is something that you really don't want to skip. So you need to practice, but also play. Keep that in mind. And I think things like this are fantastic. And the thing you need to do is like find those little things for yourself. Find those little things that work for you, where you can have like this little cheat codes that you find through practice that you then play with and keep playing with. Because essentially that will make you a much more efficient artist, both in general figure design, but in any type of artistic endeavor anyway. So those are 4 things that I would say you should always go back to, right? You don't go simple enough in the beginning, then you usually advance in the wrong way, meaning that you overcomplicate the things you don't necessarily need to overcomplicate at first. You first, again, almost like what I said, need to play with those simplicity and form, and use the right things to learn the figure. Because the figure is not a character, especially in drawing, is not a set of anatomical parts. A figure is more about proportions and balance and animation. That's why in animation, they can make a pillow or a chandelier come to life. That's a figure, but it has no anatomical parts. And this is important to understand. And then always go back to basics, right? So once you understand a more complex form, let's say, go back to basics of the figure itself, of animation, gesture, all of that. And then again, play, practice and play. So keep practicing, but also play with what you've practiced. This is essentially important as well. Pretty easy to practice, so there you go. Have fun.